I'm Olivia Carson, 34 years old, and I never imagined my own sister would publicly humiliate me during the biggest presentation of my career. After years of sibling rivalry, Natalie chose that moment to accidentally pour scalding coffee all over my silk blouse and laptop. As my colleagues snickered and whispered, I felt utterly defeated. What happened next shocked everyone, especially when my husband walked through those boardroom doors. Nobody at work knew I was married to Ethan Carson, the billionaire CEO they'd been negotiating with for months. If you're watching this, let me know where you're tuning in from. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you've ever dealt with toxic family members at work. Growing up in a modest three-bedroom house in Boston's Dorchester neighborhood, my family seemed normal on the surface. Mom worked as a nurse at Massachusetts General, Dad taught high school mathematics, and my sister Natalie was just 3 years younger than me. But beneath that ordinary facade, an intense rivalry brewed between us sisters. From the beginning, Natalie displayed an insatiable need to outshine me. When I made the honor roll, she had to make high honors. When I was selected for the school play, she campaigned for the lead role. My parents, exhausted from their demanding careers, often overlooked this unhealthy competition, dismissing it with "that's just how sisters are." School became my sanctuary. I poured myself into academics, finding that knowledge was something Natalie couldn't simply take from me. While she excelled at making friends and building social connections, I built my future through scholarships and academic achievement. By senior year, I had secured a full ride to Northwestern University, escaping Boston and Natalie's shadow. College offered the fresh start I desperately needed. For the first time, I could define myself without constant comparison. I majored in business administration with a focus on corporate strategy, graduated summa cum laude, and secured an internship at McKinsey Consulting that transitioned into a full-time position. For almost a decade, I built my career there, climbing from junior analyst to senior consultant through dedication and 80-hour work weeks. Natalie, meanwhile, jumped between marketing jobs in Boston, each one seemingly more prestigious than the last, though she never stayed anywhere longer than 18 months. We maintained superficial contact through holiday gatherings and occasional phone calls, but the underlying tension never dissolved. Then, 5 years ago, everything in my personal life changed at a charity gala in Chicago. I had been sent to represent McKinley at a fundraiser for educational initiatives in underserved communities. Wearing a borrowed dress and feeling somewhat out of place among the city's elite, I found myself bidding against a tall, dark-haired man for a silent auction item, a rare first-edition book of poetry. "You must really want this book," he said with an amused smile after outbidding me for the third time. Whitman's Leaves of Grass got me through some tough times, I admitted, but clearly not enough to afford your price range. Instead of the condescension I expected, he surprised me by asking about my connection to the poetry. We spent the next 2 hours in deep conversation, barely noticing as the gala continued around us. Ethan Carson, I discovered, was not just charming and intellectually engaging, but also the founder of Carson Holdings, a private equity firm that had quietly acquired dozens of mid-sized companies across the Midwest. Our relationship developed rapidly after that night. Within 6 months, we were engaged, and 4 months later, we married in a small ceremony with just 20 guests. Ethan respected my desire to keep our relationship private from my professional life. I had worked too hard to have my accomplishments attributed to my husband's influence. "Your independence is part of why I fell in love with you," he said when I expressed concerns about colleagues discovering our marriage. "I understand wanting to succeed on your own terms." So I continued at McKinley under my maiden name, taking on increasingly complex projects and building my reputation independently. Ethan traveled frequently for his business, and I remained dedicated to my career. We built a life together based on mutual respect, intellectual connection, and shared values rather than public displays of our relationship. 2 months ago, my carefully separated worlds began to collide when I walked into our Monday morning team meeting and saw a familiar face among the new hires. "Everyone, I'd like you to welcome Natalie Bennett to our Chicago office," announced Roger, our division director. "She's joining us from Harrison Partners in Boston with impressive experience in client acquisition." My sister's eyes met mine across the conference table, her smile revealing nothing to our colleagues about our connection. She had moved to Chicago and accepted a position at my company without even mentioning it to me or our parents. Later that day, when I finally cornered her in the break room, her explanation left me cold. "Surprise," she said, stirring honey into her tea. Harrison Partners was getting stale, and when I saw McKinley had an opening in Chicago, it seemed perfect. Plus, now we can have sister dinners every week. "You could have told me," I said, keeping my voice low. "This is unexpected." "Would you have been supportive?" she asked, eyebrow raised. "Or would you have worried about me encroaching on your territory?" Before I could respond, Roger appeared, enthusiastically discussing Natalie's role in the upcoming Apex merger, my project, the one I'd been developing for months. Somehow, she had already managed to insert herself into my most significant professional opportunity to date. As weeks passed, the familiar pattern reemerged. Natalie charmed key stakeholders, subtly questioned my strategies in meetings, and positioned herself as an innovative thinker while painting my more careful, data-driven approaches as overly cautious. With each passing day, I felt my grip on the project loosening as she gained influence. What Natalie couldn't know was that the Apex merger wasn't actually a merger at all. It was an acquisition by Carson Holdings, Ethan's company. For ethical reasons, I had recused myself from the earliest discussions when I realized Ethan's interest in the deal, but remained project lead for the transition planning. Only the most senior executives knew the full details, which would be announced following the board presentation next week. The night before the incident, I sat at our dining room table surrounded by presentation materials, anxiety knotting my stomach. "You've prepared thoroughly," Ethan said, setting a cup of tea beside me. "The board will see the value of your implementation strategy. It's not just about the presentation," I admitted. "It's Natalie. She's somehow turned half the team against me in just 8 weeks. Ethan frowned. "That's not just sibling rivalry, Olivia. That's workplace sabotage." "I know," I sighed. "But if I raise concerns now, it'll look like I'm making excuses or can't handle competition. Tomorrow needs to go perfectly. Everything I've worked for depends on it." Little did I know how dramatically things would veer from perfect in just 24 hours. The Apex acquisition represented everything I had worked toward in my career, a complex, challenging project requiring strategic vision and careful execution. As lead consultant, I would present our implementation plan to McKinley's executive board and the mysterious representatives from Apex's potential buyer. If successful, this project could finally earn me consideration for partnership, a goal I'd pursued for years. I threw myself into preparation, analyzing financial projections, organizational structures, and market conditions to craft the perfect transition strategy. My team of 8 consultants gathered data, created models, and developed comprehensive plans under my direction. Night after night, I stayed hours after everyone else had gone home, refining our approach and anticipating every possible question. Everyone except Natalie seemed impressed with the direction we were taking. She raised questions during team meetings that undermined my authority, often beginning with phrases like, "I'm just playing devil's advocate," or in my experience at Harrison Partners. Her concerns always sounded reasonable on the surface, but consistently served to create doubt about my leadership. Despite this, the project progressed well. 3 days before the presentation, I received an unexpected text from Natalie asking if we could meet for dinner. "Just sisters," she wrote. "No work talk." We met at a small Italian restaurant near my apartment. For the first hour, it felt almost like we'd rewound time to before the competition began. Natalie asked about my life in Chicago, shared funny stories about her disastrous attempt at online dating, and seemed genuinely interested in reconnecting. I know my arriving at McKinley was a shock, she said over tiramisu. But I've missed having my big sister in my life. Maybe this is a chance for us to start fresh. The sincerity in her eyes made me want to believe her. We parted with a hug, and for the first time in years, I felt hopeful about our relationship. Maybe adulthood had finally given us the perspective to move beyond our rivalry. That hope began to crumble the next morning when I discovered key files missing from our shared project drive. Files I distinctly remembered uploading myself. When I mentioned this during our team check-in, Natalie immediately offered a solution. I noticed some inconsistencies in those models yesterday and took them home to fix, she explained, pulling a flash drive from her purse. I was going to tell you, but you seemed so stressed about the presentation. Before I could respond, she had plugged in the drive and was showing the team her improved versions of my work. Several elements had been changed significantly, altering the strategy I'd carefully developed. These changes undermine our entire approach, I said as calmly as possible after the meeting, once we were alone. Do they? Or do they make it better? She countered. The original projections were too conservative. We need to show ambition if we want to impress the board. Ambition based on flawed assumptions isn't impressive. It's irresponsible, I insisted. Please don't alter my work without discussing it first. Our work, she corrected with a smile. We're a team, remember? That afternoon, I received notification that Thursday's final preparation meeting had been rescheduled to Wednesday, today at 3 o'clock. I rushed to the conference room only to find several team members missing. Didn't you get the update? Natalie asked innocently. It was changed back to Thursday. I sent an email an hour ago. I never received that email, nor could I find it in my inbox later. When Thursday's meeting finally occurred, 3 team members arrived with completely different datasets than what we'd previously agreed upon, claiming they'd received updated instructions. The presentation was becoming a disjointed mess, and with each passing hour, I felt my control slipping away. Most disturbing was how Natalie had managed to form alliances with influential colleagues in such a short time. Davis from IT now prioritized her technical requests over mine. Melissa from graphics had redesigned our presentation templates to match Natalie's preferences. Even Roger, my longtime supporter, had begun seeking Natalie's input on decisions that previously would have come directly to me. The night before the presentation, I stayed at the office until nearly midnight, integrating the fragmented pieces into a coherent narrative. Just as I was preparing to leave, I opened the final slide deck for one last review and felt my heart sink. The executive summary, the most crucial section that framed our entire strategy, had been completely rewritten, emphasizing approaches I had specifically advised against. The document history showed the changes had been made by Natalie just 2 hours earlier. I called her immediately. The team felt the original summary didn't capture our collective vision, she explained, sounding half asleep. I was going to tell you tomorrow morning. This isn't a collective vision situation, Natalie. This is a structured strategy that I've been developing for months. Well, maybe that's the problem, she said, her voice hardening. You've been so focused on your vision that you haven't listened to anyone else's input. The team is just trying to salvage this presentation. After we hung up, I sat alone in the darkened office, my reflection staring back at me from the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. I had 2 choices. Accept these last-minute changes that contradicted my professional judgment, or work through the night to restore my original strategy. With tears of frustration threatening, I opened my laptop and began rebuilding the presentation from scratch. At 4 a.m, I finally emailed the corrected version to myself and the team, briefly explaining that I had resolved inconsistencies in the materials. 3 hours later, after a quick shower and change of clothes at home, I returned to the office, exhausted but determined to make the presentation successful despite everything. Little did I know that the worst sabotage was yet to come. The morning of the presentation dawned with a magnificent Chicago sunrise, the kind that might have seemed like a good omen under different circumstances. Instead, running on just 3 hours of sleep and too much caffeine, I barely noticed the golden light streaming through the windows as I hurried into the McKinley building at 6:30. My plan was simple: arrive early, review everything one final time, prepare the conference room, and center myself before the team arrived. But when I swiped my key card at the executive floor entrance, the light flashed red instead of green. I tried again with the same result. "Sorry, Ms. Bennett," said the security guard who eventually came to assist me. "Looks like your access was temporarily suspended for system updates. Let me override it for you." Inside my office, more surprises awaited. The presentation remote I had tested yesterday was missing from my desk drawer. The special laser pointer I'd brought from home had disappeared from my bag. The catering order for breakfast had been changed to start an hour later than I'd scheduled, meaning the executives would arrive to an unprepared room. One by one, I addressed each issue, the knot in my stomach tightening with each solved problem. This wasn't coincidence or bad luck. This was targeted sabotage. By 8 o'clock, team members began filtering in. Natalie arrived looking fresh and poised in a crisp navy suit, carrying a tray of premium coffee cups. "Thought we could all use some liquid courage," she announced, distributing them to grateful colleagues. "Olivia, I got you your favorite, vanilla latte, extra shot." I accepted the piece offering cautiously, noting how easily she had remembered my coffee preference despite our years of limited contact. Perhaps I was being paranoid. Perhaps the sabotage was just in my head. That fragile hope shattered when I connected my laptop to the presentation system and discovered that several of my restored slides had reverted to earlier versions. Somehow, someone had accessed and modified the file after my 4 a.m. update. "Technical difficulties?" Natalie asked, suddenly beside me. "Want me to have Davis take a look?" "I've got it," I said, fingers flying across the keyboard as I made emergency corrections. "Just need to refresh some content." "Well, hurry up. The board members are on their way up," she replied with a glance at her watch. "And those mystery executives from the acquiring company too." The next 15 minutes passed in a blur as I frantically repaired the presentation while simultaneously greeting arriving executives and directing the now-arrived catering staff. Through it all, Natalie floated effortlessly among the attendees, charming them with small talk and inside jokes as though she'd known them for years rather than weeks. At precisely 9 o'clock, Roger called the meeting to order. 24 people sat around the massive conference table, 8 board members, 6 senior executives from McKinley, my project team, and 4 unidentified individuals who had arrived last and taken seats at the far end of the room. These last 4, dressed in impeccable suits and maintaining professional poker faces, were presumably representatives from Carson Holdings, including, though no one knew it yet, my husband Ethan. I hadn't expected him personally. We had agreed it would be better if he sent his acquisition team to maintain the separation between our professional lives. Seeing him there, deliberately avoiding eye contact to preserve our secret, added another layer of tension to an already stressful situation. "Before we begin," Roger announced, "I want to acknowledge the exceptional work of our strategy team, led by Olivia Bennett with strong support from our newest star, Natalie Bennett." A murmur went through the room as people connected our last names. "Yes, they're sisters," Roger confirmed with a smile. "Talent clearly runs in the family. Now, Olivia, the floor is yours." Standing at the head of the table, I took a deep breath and launched into the presentation. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the sabotage, the unexpected presence of my husband, years of professional experience took over. My voice remained steady as I outlined the strategic vision for integrating the two companies, highlighting synergies and addressing potential challenges. For the first 20 minutes, everything proceeded smoothly. Then Natalie began her subtle interruptions. Olivia, may I add some context to that point? She would interject, then proceed to reframe my statements in ways that subtly contradicted my recommendations. Or, I think what my sister means to suggest is, followed by an entirely different approach than what I had actually proposed. Each time, I would professionally acknowledge her input before attempting to redirect back to my original points. Each time, I noticed certain executives nodding along with Natalie's clarifications rather than my carefully researched strategies. Halfway through the 2-hour presentation, Roger announced a 15-minute coffee break before the financial projections section. Perfect timing, Natalie said brightly. I'll grab fresh coffee for everyone. As the room dispersed for a brief respite, I remained at the podium, reviewing my notes for the next section. From the corner of my eye, I saw Ethan engaged in quiet conversation with his team, still maintaining our professional distance. He glanced my way once, his expression revealing nothing to outside observers, but speaking volumes to me about his concern. The break ended with Natalie carefully balancing a large tray of filled coffee cups as she re-entered the room. Sorry for the delay, she called out cheerfully. The good coffee machine was backed up. I've got everyone's orders here. Careful, they're hot. She began distributing cups to the executives nearest the door, working her way around the table toward where I stood. The presentation was set to resume, all eyes returning to the front of the room, to me. That's when everything fell apart. Oops. The word hung in the air as Natalie's foot caught on something, nothing, and the tray tilted dramatically. 3 cups of steaming coffee launched forward, their contents arcing directly toward me in what felt like slow motion. I had just enough time to gasp before the scalding liquid splashed across my cream-colored silk blouse and onto my laptop keyboard. The pain was immediate and shocking, a burning sensation spreading across my chest and stomach as the coffee soaked through to my skin. Oh my God, Olivia. Natalie's hands flew to her face in theatrical horror. I'm so sorry. I tripped on the cord. There was no cord. I knew it, and from the slight curl at the corner of her mouth, barely perceptible to anyone who hadn't grown up studying her expressions, she knew I knew it. The room's reaction unfolded in layers around me as I stood frozen, coffee dripping from my ruined blouse. First came the shocked silence, then concerned murmurs, followed by something worse, the stifled laughter. It started with Davis, a short, suppressed snort, then spread to Melissa and 2 other team members, the same ones who had aligned themselves with Natalie in recent weeks. Someone get some napkins, Roger called out, but his voice carried an undertone of impatience rather than genuine concern. What a disaster, whispered someone behind me, not quietly enough. As Natalie made a show of blotting my blouse with cocktail napkins, managing somehow to make the stain worse with each dab, I caught sight of the 4 visitors from Carson Holdings. 3 watched with professional neutrality, but Ethan's jaw was clenched tight, his eyes darkening in a way I recognized from rare moments of genuine anger. Perhaps you should go clean up, suggested Margaret Winters, the most senior board member present. Her tone made it clear this wasn't actually a suggestion. We can continue with the, financial section while you're gone. I can cover. Natalie volunteered immediately. I'm familiar with all the projections. Of course she was. She had altered them repeatedly over the past week. That would be helpful, Margaret agreed with a relieved smile. Olivia, take whatever time you need. Whatever time I needed. As though I had merely spilled a drop of water on my sleeve, not had hot coffee deliberately poured across my body during the most important presentation of my career. As though I could simply rinse out the second-degree burns forming on my skin and return good as new. With as much dignity as I could muster, I gathered my soaked notebook and damaged laptop. I'll be back shortly, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Natalie, please use the original projections we finalized last night, not the draft versions. She smiled sweetly. Of course, sis. I'll handle everything. The walk to the executive restroom felt eternal. Every step was a battle against tears of pain, humiliation, and rage. Once inside the marble sanctuary, I locked the door and finally allowed myself to examine the damage. Angry red splotches were forming across my chest where the coffee had burned through the thin silk. My carefully selected blouse, the one I had splurged on specifically for this presentation, was ruined beyond salvation, the cream fabric now stained a mottled brown. Worse, my laptop keyboard was sticky and unresponsive, the presentation files possibly corrupted or inaccessible. I had backup copies, but they were in my office, and returning there meant walking through the hallways in my current state, inviting more stares and whispers. In the privacy of the bathroom stall, I finally surrendered to the tears that had been threatening all morning. Years of competition, months of subtle sabotage, and now this public humiliation, it was too much. Every professional boundary had been crossed, every personal vulnerability exploited. Through blurred vision, I texted Ethan. She did it on purpose. Everyone laughed. Can't face going back in. I didn't expect an immediate response. In the boardroom, he would be maintaining our professional separation, unable to check his phone. I sent the message more as a release valve for my emotions than an actual cry for help. As cold water ran over my hands, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes were red-rimmed, my makeup smudged, my blouse beyond repair. The woman looking back at me seemed defeated in a way I hadn't allowed myself to be since childhood, when Natalie's competitive tactics first began breaking my spirit. That realization, that I was allowing myself to be that vulnerable child again, sparked something in me. I hadn't built my career, my marriage, my life by surrendering when things got difficult. Natalie wanted me to hide in this bathroom, to concede the presentation and the victory to her. Every instinct urged me to run, to protect myself from further humiliation. Instead, I straightened my shoulders and began methodically addressing what could be fixed. With paper towels and hand soap, I did my best to clean the coffee from my skin, wincing at the tenderness of the burned areas. From my emergency kit in my purse, I found a travel-sized stain remover that made minimal difference to the blouse, but helped me feel like I was taking action. My spare phone charger became a substitute for the laptop, capable of advancing slides remotely if the presentation file could still be accessed on the room's system. 20 minutes after my humiliating exit, I made a decision. I could return to that room with my stained blouse and reddened eyes, facing the judgment and pity of everyone present, or I could leave the building and concede defeat. The former option would be excruciating but would preserve my professional dignity. The latter would be easier but would haunt my career indefinitely. Taking a deep breath, I gathered my things and unlocked the bathroom door. It was time to face whatever came next. The boardroom fell silent as I slipped quietly through the door. Natalie stood at the podium where I had been positioned earlier, confidently gesturing toward a slide I didn't recognize, one that certainly hadn't been in my presentation. The executives were leaning forward, engaged in her narrative, while my team members took notes dutifully. Which is why the aggressive expansion timeline I'm proposing offers substantially higher returns than the more conservative approach originally outlined, she was saying, her voice carrying the rehearsed cadence of someone who had prepared extensively for this moment. No one acknowledged my return as I took an empty seat near the back of the room. It was as though I had become invisible, my role in the project erased by a cup of coffee and 30 minutes of absence. I watched as Natalie smoothly presented financial projections that contradicted everything I had meticulously developed, claiming credit for analysis that my team had spent months perfecting under my guidance. Any questions about the financial models before I move on to implementation recommendations? Natalie asked, pausing to scan the room with practiced confidence. Before anyone could respond, the boardroom door opened again. All heads turned as Ethan Carson stepped into the room, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. Though I had known he was in the building, his entrance still sent a jolt through me. Something had changed. His deliberate anonymity had been abandoned. "Please continue," he said to Natalie, his voice measured as he took the empty seat beside me. The casual brush of his hand against mine under the table sent a clear message. I was not alone in this fight. Natalie hesitated for just a moment before recovering her composure. As I was saying, our implementation strategy prioritizes rapid integration of sales teams within the first quarter, followed by— "Excuse me," Ethan interrupted, his tone polite but firm. "Before you proceed, I have a question about authorship." The room grew tense as Natalie blinked in confusion. "Authorship?" "Yes," Ethan continued, standing now. "I'm curious about who developed the original strategic framework for this acquisition." Roger cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Perhaps introductions are in order first. This is Ethan Carson, CEO of Carson Holdings." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Carson Holdings was known for keeping a low profile, with most people expecting representatives rather than the CEO himself at such meetings. "Mr. Carson," Natalie recovered quickly, professional smile firmly in place. "The strategy was developed collaboratively by our team under my sister's initial direction. I've made some recent adjustments based on feedback from key stakeholders." "Interesting," Ethan replied, opening a leather portfolio he had brought with him. "Because I have here the original proposal submitted to my company 3 months ago, outlining a strategy remarkably similar to what Ms. Bennett, Olivia Bennett, was presenting earlier before the coffee incident. Yet quite different from what you're presenting now." The atmosphere in the room shifted perceptibly. Board members exchanged glances as Natalie's smile faltered. "What exactly is your relationship to McKinley Consulting, Mr. Carson?" Margaret Winters asked cautiously. "Beyond being the CEO of the company acquiring Apex Technologies?" "Nothing formal," Ethan answered. Then, with deliberate timing, he added, "except that I'm married to your lead strategist, Olivia Bennett. Or, as I know her, Olivia Carson." The revelation landed like a thunderclap in the silent room. All eyes swiveled between Ethan and me, faces registering shock, confusion, and in some cases, dawning horror. That's not possible," Natalie stammered, her composure cracking. "She never mentioned being married. My wife values her professional accomplishments on their own merit," Ethan replied smoothly. "She recused herself from the acquisition negotiations once she realized Carson Holdings was involved, but continued leading the integration strategy because of her expertise. Expertise that appears to have been systematically undermined and now claimed by others." Roger had gone pale. "Olivia, is this true?" Finding my voice at last, I stood to join Ethan. "Yes, Ethan and I have been married for 5 years. I've kept it private to maintain professional boundaries. Only the ethics committee was informed when I recused myself from the acquisition negotiations. A committee that apparently failed to maintain appropriate confidentiality," Ethan added, his gaze sweeping the room. "Which brings me to a more pressing concern than the acquisition itself. I've witnessed today what appears to be a deliberate pattern of workplace sabotage, culminating in a physical assault with hot coffee. It was an accident." Natalie protested, but her voice had lost its authoritative edge. "Was it?" Ethan countered. "Because from where I was sitting, it looked remarkably intentional." As did the laughter that followed from several people in this room. He turned to address the entire group now, his expression hardened into the formidable business leader known for transforming struggling companies into profitable enterprises. "Let me be very clear about something. Carson Holdings doesn't just acquire companies. We acquire talent. The entire purpose of this acquisition was to retain the strategic minds that made Apex and McKinley valuable in the first place. But talent requires a culture of integrity and professionalism to thrive." Directing his attention to Davis, who had been among those laughing earlier, Ethan continued, "When I see IT professionals who manipulate access credentials to sabotage colleagues." His gaze shifted to Melissa from graphics. "When I see support staff altering documents without authorization." Finally, his focus returned to Natalie, and when I witnessed blatant attempts to undermine and humiliate a senior consultant through weeks of calculated actions, I question whether this is an organization worthy of partnership. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, as the full implications of his words registered across the room. "Mr. Carson," Margaret Winters finally ventured, "I assure you that McKinley Consulting maintains the highest professional standards. If there have been irregularities in this project, they certainly don't reflect our company values." "Then you won't object to addressing them immediately," Ethan replied. "Starting with a formal investigation into what transpired here today and in the weeks leading up to it." It was then that I realized what Ethan was doing, not just defending me, but using his leverage as the acquiring CEO to force accountability that might otherwise have been swept under the rug. The power dynamic in the room had completely reversed. Those who had been smirking at my humiliation now sat rigid with apprehension. "I believe we should adjourn this meeting temporarily," Roger suggested, his earlier dismissiveness replaced with grave concern. "Perhaps reconvene after lunch, when we've had time to process this information." "An excellent suggestion," Ethan agreed. "And while we're at it, I'd like to speak privately with HR about certain emails and documentation I've received over the past several weeks regarding this project team's dynamics." As the room began to empty, shell-shocked executives filing out in uncomfortable silence, Natalie remained frozen at the podium, her carefully constructed triumph crumbling around her. When only she, Ethan, and I remained, she finally spoke. "You've been spying on me? Gathering evidence." Her voice trembled with indignation and fear. "That's low, even for you, Olivia." "I didn't need to spy, Natalie," I replied quietly. "Your actions spoke for themselves." The woman who had poured coffee on me less than an hour ago suddenly looked very small, very young, and very afraid as Ethan held the door open, silently indicating it was time for her to leave as well. As the door closed behind her, leaving Ethan and me alone in the boardroom, the full emotional weight of the morning finally caught up with me. My legs weakened, and I sank into the nearest chair. "I'm sorry," Ethan said softly, kneeling beside me. "I know we agreed to keep our relationship separate from your work, but watching what happened, I couldn't stay silent." "Thank you," I whispered, tears threatening again, but different ones this time. Relief, vindication, and the profound gratitude of being truly seen and supported when it mattered most. What had started as the worst professional humiliation of my career had transformed into something entirely unexpected. A moment of truth that would change everything about my relationship with my sister, my colleagues, and perhaps most significantly, my own professional identity. The McKinley Chicago office transformed into a hive of urgent activity following the aborted presentation. Through the glass walls of the conference room where Ethan and I remained, I could see executives huddled in tense conversation, HR representatives hurrying between offices, and team members being called individually into Roger's office. Within 30 minutes, Diane Powell, the national HR director, requested to join us. A no-nonsense woman with 20 years of experience navigating corporate crises, she entered the room with an iPad and a grave expression. "Mr. and Mrs. Carson," she began, the combined address immediately acknowledging the reality of our relationship, "I want to assure you that McKinley takes allegations of workplace harassment and sabotage extremely seriously. We've initiated our formal investigation protocol." "I appreciate your prompt response," Ethan replied, "but I'm concerned about the scope. This isn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of behavior spanning weeks." Diane nodded. "We're already gathering documentation. Several concerning emails have been recovered from the server archives." She turned to me. "Olivia, we'll need your formal statement, and, if you're willing, documentation of the physical injury from the coffee incident." The clinical term physical injury somehow made the reality of my burned skin more significant. I hadn't thought to photograph the reddened areas across my chest and stomach, now hidden beneath my stained blouse, but doing so would provide tangible evidence of the harm done. I'll provide whatever's needed, I agreed. There's something else you should know, Diane continued, her expression tightening. We've conducted preliminary interviews with your team members. Davis from IT has already admitted to temporarily suspending your access credentials this morning at Natalie's request. He claims he was told it was a practical joke, for your birthday. My birthday is in October, I said flatly. Yes, we're aware, Diane replied. He's also acknowledged accessing your presentation files on multiple occasions using administrative privileges. Melissa from Graphics has similarly admitted to making unauthorized changes to your materials at Natalie's direction. As Diane continued outlining the emerging evidence, a picture formed of systematic undermining far more calculated than even I had realized. Natalie hadn't just acted on impulsive competitive instincts. She had methodically targeted my project, my reputation, and ultimately my physical person in a campaign that could only be described as sabotage. What happens now? I asked when Diane finished her preliminary report. The investigation will continue throughout the day. We've asked everyone involved to remain in the building and make themselves available for further questioning. Once we've gathered all statements and evidence, appropriate disciplinary actions will be determined. The passive voice, disciplinary actions will be determined, caught Ethan's attention. By whom? He asked pointedly. Because as CEO of the company currently acquiring your client, I have a vested interest in ensuring the response is proportionate to the offense. Diane met his gaze directly. Normally, discipline would be handled internally according to our established protocols. However, given the circumstances and your company's involvement, we welcome Carson Holdings' input on the resolution. After she left, Ethan and I were escorted to a private office to await further developments. For nearly 2 hours, we sat in relative silence, processing the morning's events and their implications for both our professional and personal lives. I never wanted it to happen this way, I finally said, breaking the quiet. The whole point of keeping our relationship private was to avoid having my work viewed through the lens of your position. I know, Ethan replied, taking my hand. But maybe the bigger question is, why did you feel you needed to hide such a fundamental part of your life to be taken seriously? His question struck a nerve. Throughout my career, I had compartmentalized my identity, professional Olivia separate from personal Olivia, believing that was necessary for success. Watching that carefully constructed wall crumble was disorienting, but also strangely liberating. At 3 o'clock, we were invited to rejoin the executive team in the boardroom. The atmosphere had transformed dramatically from the morning session. Gone was the casual dismissiveness that had permitted Natalie's behavior to flourish. In its place was a somber professionalism tinged with unmistakable anxiety. Margaret Winters opened the meeting. First, I want to extend our sincere apologies to you, Olivia, for what occurred today. The behavior witnessed falls far short of McKinley's professional standards. Roger, looking significantly more subdued than earlier, continued, our investigation has confirmed multiple instances of unethical behavior targeting Olivia's work and reputation. The evidence is unambiguous and deeply troubling. Diane presented a summary of findings that validated every suspicion I'd harbored over the past weeks. Natalie had systematically undermined my project through manipulation of team members, unauthorized access to confidential materials, and deliberate misrepresentation of my work to senior management. The coffee incident, far from being accidental, represented the culmination of this campaign. Based on these findings, Diane concluded, we are terminating Natalie Bennett's employment effective immediately for gross misconduct. Additionally, Davis Thomas and Melissa Chen will be terminated for their active participation in these activities. I had expected to feel vindication at this announcement, but instead found myself experiencing a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and lingering anger. These consequences, while appropriate, couldn't undo the damage already done to my project, to my professional relationships, and to my family. That addresses the most egregious participants, Ethan acknowledged, but what about the broader cultural issues that allowed this behavior to flourish? I witnessed senior management and team members laughing at a colleague's humiliation and injury. That suggests a deeper problem than 3 bad actors. Margaret shifted uncomfortably. We're implementing immediate retraining on workplace conduct for all Chicago office personnel and reviewing our harassment policies company-wide. With respect, I interjected, finding my voice. Retraining doesn't address accountability. Everyone in that room this morning had a choice when they saw me doused with hot coffee. Most chose to find it amusing rather than concerning. That's not a training issue, it's a character issue. A tense silence followed my statement. What would you suggest, Olivia? Roger finally asked. The question caught me off guard. After weeks of having my suggestions undermined or ignored, being directly asked for my recommendation felt almost disorienting. But I knew exactly what needed to happen. Anyone who actively participated in the mockery should be removed from this project immediately. The acquisition integration is too important to be undermined by individuals who've demonstrated such poor judgment. Ethan nodded in agreement. Carson Holdings will proceed with the Apex acquisition as planned, but with significant changes to the integration team structure. We'll be bringing in additional oversight from our side and conducting our own assessment of appropriate personnel for the project. The executives exchanged glances, recognizing the implicit message. The partnership would continue, but the power dynamic had permanently shifted. McKinley was no longer directing this project. They were now accountable to Carson Holdings in ways that extended beyond the normal client relationship. As the meeting concluded with agreements for next steps, Diane approached me privately. Natalie has requested to speak with you before she leaves the building. You're under no obligation to agree. Part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the professional boundary that had been so thoroughly violated. But another part, perhaps the sister rather than the consultant, needed closure. I'll see her, I decided. In the small conference room, please. 15 minutes later, Natalie entered the room, her earlier confidence replaced with a brittle defensiveness. She had been crying, her carefully applied makeup now smudged around her eyes. Congratulations, she said bitterly, remaining standing near the door. You've won. Again. This wasn't a competition, Natalie. It was my career. My project. Everything has always been a competition between us, she countered. From the moment I was born, I was playing catch-up to perfect Olivia. Mom and Dad's golden child, the one who could do no wrong. The distortion of our shared past was so profound it momentarily left me speechless. In my memory, our parents had been largely absent, consumed by their demanding careers, while Natalie had been the favored one, more social, more naturally charming, more adept at winning approval. That's not how it was, I finally managed. No. Her laugh held no humor. You left for Northwestern with a full scholarship and never looked back. You built your perfect life in Chicago while I struggled to make something of myself in Boston. Then when I finally got this opportunity at McKinley, I arrived to find you'd secretly married a billionaire. You've been playing with a stacked deck all along. The raw pain in her voice was genuine, even if her perspective was distorted. For the first time, I glimpsed how our relationship looked through her eyes, not as the competition she had created, but as a race she believed had been rigged against her from the start. I'm sorry you see it that way, I said quietly. But nothing justifies what you did. Maybe not, she admitted, some of the fight leaving her body. But it felt justified at the time. When I realized who your husband was, who you really were beneath all your claims of making it on your own merit, something just snapped. In that moment, looking at my sister's tear-streaked face, I felt an unexpected wave of compassion beneath my lingering anger. We were both products of the same emotionally distant household, both shaped by the insecurities that environment had fostered. The difference was not in our starting points, but in the choices we had made in response to those shared wounds. "I hope you find what you're looking for, Natalie," I said. "But I don't think you'll find it by tearing others down." She nodded almost imperceptibly, then turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "For what it's worth, I am sorry about the coffee. I didn't think it would burn you." It wasn't a full acknowledgement of everything she had done, but it was perhaps as close to genuine remorse as she could manage in that moment. After she left, I remained in the conference room alone, processing the conversation and the day's events. My sister had been fired. Multiple colleagues had been terminated. My carefully separated professional and personal identities had collided irrevocably. Nothing would return to how it had been before. Yet, amid the wreckage of my former working life, I felt an unexpected sense of liberation. The walls I had built between different aspects of myself had been protective, but also limiting. Perhaps their collapse offered an opportunity to rebuild something more integrated, more authentic, and ultimately stronger. 1 year after the coffee incident, I stood at the window of my new office on the 38th floor of the Carson Holdings building, watching early autumn leaves swirl across Millennium Park. The view never failed to center me, especially on days like today, the anniversary of the event that had transformed my professional and personal life in ways I couldn't have imagined. The McKinley Apex integration had proceeded, but with significant changes to the original plan. After careful evaluation, Carson Holdings had ultimately acquired McKinley Consulting as well, merging both companies into a new subsidiary focused on strategic corporate transformation. I now led that division as managing director, reporting to a board that included Ethan but maintained substantial operational independence. The transition hadn't been easy. Following the incident, I had taken 6 weeks of leave to recover both physically and emotionally. The coffee burns had healed quickly, but the psychological impact of public humiliation and family betrayal required more time and professional support to process. "You experienced workplace trauma," my therapist had explained during our initial sessions, "compounded by the fact that the perpetrator was your sister. That's a complex injury requiring intentional healing." Through therapy, I confronted not just the recent events, but the long-standing patterns in my relationship with Natalie and our family dynamics. I came to understand how my compartmentalized approach to life, keeping work separate from personal, achievement separate from emotion, had been both a strength and a limitation. "You built walls to protect yourself," Ethan observed one evening as we discussed my therapy insights. "But walls keep out support as well as threats." He was right. By hiding our marriage from my colleagues out of fear that my accomplishments would be attributed to my husband's influence, I had inadvertently cut myself off from my strongest support system during Natalie's campaign of sabotage. The desire to succeed entirely on my own merit was understandable, but the extreme separation had become counterproductive. Rejoining the workforce meant integrating these lessons into a new approach to leadership. When I stepped into my role as managing director, I made a conscious decision to lead with both competence and authenticity. My team knew I was married to the company's CEO, but they also knew I had earned my position through demonstrated expertise and results. "Transparency doesn't diminish merit" became something of a personal mantra. It contextualizes it. Building a healthy corporate culture became my mission. We implemented structural safeguards against the kind of workplace bullying I had experienced: clear reporting channels, regular team assessments, and a zero-tolerance policy for retaliatory behavior. More importantly, we fostered an environment where collaboration genuinely outweighed competition, where team members felt valued for their contributions rather than threatened by others' success. As for Natalie, our paths had diverged completely after that day. Through our parents, I learned she had moved to Seattle and found work with a small marketing firm. We exchanged perfunctory birthday and holiday messages, but nothing more. The rift between us remained too deep for casual reconciliation, though I no longer carried the active anger that had initially followed her betrayal. "Forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation," my therapist had explained. It means releasing the emotional burden of what happened so you can move forward unburdened. That distinction had been crucial to my healing process. I could forgive Natalie, understanding the insecurities and distorted perceptions that had driven her actions, without reopening the door to a relationship that had consistently caused pain. Forgiveness was for my benefit, not hers. 6 months after the incident, I received an unexpected email from Melissa, the graphic designer who had been terminated for her role in the sabotage. After a sincere apology for her actions, she shared something revealing. "Natalie told us you were using your husband's position to fast-track your career," she wrote. "She said you were taking credit for her ideas and that the coffee prank was planned as a harmless way to give you a taste of humility." I believed her because she was so convincing, so detailed in her stories about your past. I'm not excusing what I did, but I wanted you to know the extent of the manipulation. Many of us were pawns in a game we didn't understand. The email provided a missing piece of the puzzle, how Natalie had so quickly turned colleagues against me. She had weaponized the very thing I had tried to keep private, using my marriage as evidence of unearned privilege rather than what it actually was, a purposefully separate part of my life. The irony wasn't lost on me. In trying to prevent people from attributing my success to my husband's position, I had created the perfect vacuum for Natalie to fill with her own narrative. Had I been more open about my life, her manipulation might have been recognized for what it was. Today, leading my team meeting, I carried these lessons with me. The 25 people gathered around the conference table represented the culture we had intentionally built, diverse, collaborative, and fundamentally respectful. When disagreements arose, they were addressed directly and professionally. When successes occurred, they were celebrated collectively. Before we conclude, I said as the meeting wound down, I want to acknowledge today's significance. 1 year ago, I experienced one of the most challenging moments of my professional life. Rather than bury that history, I've chosen to mark it as a turning point that ultimately led to where we are now. The room grew quiet, many aware of my history, though we rarely discussed it directly. What I learned through that experience shaped everything about how we've structured this division. When we talk about psychological safety, about integrity, about supporting each other's growth, these aren't abstract values to me. They're the foundation of sustainable success. After the meeting, Janelle, one of our newest team members, stopped by my office. "I hope this isn't overstepping," she said hesitantly, "but I wanted to thank you for being so open about your experience. In my previous job, I witnessed similar sabotage but felt powerless to address it. Knowing that our leadership has lived through it and actively prevents it makes all the difference in how secure I feel here." Her words crystallized something I had been feeling increasingly over the past year. The painful experience that had initially seemed like a professional catastrophe had transformed into a source of authentic leadership. By integrating that chapter into my professional narrative rather than compartmentalizing it away, I had found a deeper connection with my team and a clearer purpose in my work. That evening, as Ethan and I walked along the lakefront path near our home, I shared this realization with him. The walls coming down was the best thing that could have happened, I concluded. Not just between my work life and personal life, but between different parts of myself. I'm a more effective leader because I'm a more integrated person. "I've always seen all of you," he replied, squeezing my hand. "I'm glad you're finally getting to experience that too." As the sun set over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, I reflected on the journey of the past year. The coffee incident had burned in ways both literal and figurative, but from that pain had emerged a stronger, more authentic version of myself, one no longer divided by artificial boundaries or defined by others' perceptions. The sister who had sought to humiliate me had inadvertently set me free. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone close to you at work or in your personal life? How did you handle it, and what lessons did you learn? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe if this resonated with you, and share with anyone who might be struggling with workplace bullying or family tension. Remember, Sometimes our most painful experiences become our greatest sources of growth and wisdom. Thank you for listening to my story today.